So thank you all for coming, everyone. My name is Tobias Reynolds. I'm one of REMI's economic analysts. I'm here joined by Mei Lin, another of our analysts. And we're going to go through an economic summary of what's happening in the state of New York, followed by a policy simulation showing off some of our software. So yeah, I already kind of gave away the lead here, but we'll be talking about who we are. We'll go over some of our regional growth matrix, which is a nice little framework for figuring out how states are faring compared to other states. We'll look at how the state is doing in the short term and the long term, and then we'll do the policy simulation. In this case, studying a possible effect of working from home. So we were founded in 1980 as Regional Economic Modeling Incorporated on the idea that government decision makers should test the policies, should test the outcomes of their policies before they're implemented. We're a leader in dynamic modeling at the state, local, and national level, and we have clients across the country who use our software for rigorous economic analysis to critically influence policies. And you can see below just a smattering of our clients, including the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Florida State Legislature, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So we really are all over, very much a trusted source for economic analysis. So to kick things off, to kick off some of the introduction for the outlook, I'm going to hand things over to Mei.
Thank you, Tobias. So now let's first take a look at the New York State economy. So New York is the global financial center, but its regions outside New York City are very rural. It takes up about 1% of the land mass of the US, but manages to contribute 8% of the country's GDP. Its key industries include finance, healthcare, professional and technical services, and retail trade. So for the short-term outlook of New York, we're looking at years from 2019 to 2023. We're including 2019 as part of our projection. So going from 2020 to 2021, we see a lot of growth as the state recovers from the COVID-induced downturn. The total employment goes back by 504,000 jobs. Though we don't see the employment get back to normal before 2024, there will be a lot of uncertainty here. For example, with a large pent-up consumer demand and the supports of vaccine and stimulus checks, a more optimistic reality can be expected. So here, economic modeling offers the flexibility to try different forecasts. More will be talked about in the policy simulation part. So when we look at the economy of the state, we consider a number of different factors when assessing which direction the state is going in. Broadly, we divide the factors into two categories: economic factors and demographic factors. So if the state has strong industries, high-paid workers, and an influx of young population, as well as migrants, that puts it into generally into the favorable category. On the contrary, factors like shrinking industries, high business costs, or an older population are more unfavorable. So putting all these together, we can plot things on a quadrant. So here, the vertical axis shows a higher or a lower employment growth, and the horizontal axis shows the population growth. We will see unfavorable population trends on the left and favorable trends on the right. If we look at the top right economies, the states with growth economies have increasing employment and economy activities, as well as increasing and more vibrant population. And on the bottom left, we can see transitional economies with lower population and lower employment. People might be leaving the state. There are also states where patterns moving in different directions. For example, looking at Massachusetts, there is unfavorable population. People are leaving the state, and there's an older population, or there are high housing prices, but the economy activities are on the rise. Thus, hopefully this can attract people moving into Massachusetts, possibly reversing the population trends. And on the bottom right, there are lifestyle economies like Hawaii and Virginia where people are going to live there. Even if the employment prospects are not as good, maybe more amenities or better environment is attracting people despite of the strict economy reasons. Let's look at Washington and see how it ranks up in these regional growth categories. Excuse me, New York State. So here is New York State, the start state on the left of the horizontal axis. Employment growth from 2021 to 2022 of the US is 1.9%, and growth in New York State is the same. Of the same period, population growth in the United States is 0.7%, while in New York State, we don't see an obvious change in the population. So we can say that compared to the US average growth, New York State has a more unfavorable population. A possible reason can be the high housing prices. Now I'm going to introduce some data sources that REMI models are using. The REMI models baseline is primarily based on the US Bureau of Labor Statistics forecast data. And the economic forecast update in March 2021 is based on 3 data sources. The first one is the historical data from BA and the US Economic Outlook for 2020 to 2022 from the University of Michigan's Research Seminar in Quantitative Economics. And the third one is an update to the economics outlook from CBO. Also, this update includes 1.6 trillion stimulus, additional vaccination, and additional consumer spending. Now let's take a look at the national outlook. First, the short-term outlook for the US. We can see that the national trends are similar to those of New York State. We see a lot of increase in personal income, GDP, and output. So there's a 2.9% increase in the personal income, 4.4% in GDP, 4.4% in output, and we can see an over 7 million job increase in the total employment. Since REMI models are dynamic models, the way long-term forecast works is that the status for a region in 2022 is determined by what happens in 2023. We take those trends and extend them, then we have the long-term outlook we're looking at. So we can see the economy growing steadily with an annual growth of 1.9% in personal income, 1.8% in GDP, and 1.9% in output. We can also expect an average growth of over 700,000 jobs per year. Now let's talk more about the regional outlook for New York State. I'll be focusing on the short-term outlook, and Tobias will continue with the long-term outlook. One thing that people are very concerned about is the employment by industry. In the graph, we're showing the top 5 industries with largest employment growth rates in 2021. Among them, contribution has the largest employment growth of 7%, but healthcare and social assistance with a 6% growth in employment is contributing an increase of over 100,000 jobs. And on the next slide, we're showing the 5 industries with the highest average annual compensation rates in 2021. We see dips in some of them at the year of 2020, like caused by COVID, but the employment is steady overall. clear trends will be shown in the long-term outlook. After employment and industry, let's look at the population. Here's the population pyramid in 2021. We can see in elderly population and smaller percentage of people in a younger age cohort. It has typically characters of regions with higher levels of social and economic development, where access to quality education and healthcare is available to a larger portion of the population. And then looking at the population components in New York State, we don't see an obvious change in the total population. There are a lot of international migrants moving to New York State, but there are also there are more retired migrants and economic migrants moving out of the state. As we mentioned before, people might be attracted by a lower cost of living in other regions. So now I'm gonna give it to Tobias, who will show us more about the long-term outlook.
Thank you, May. So long-term outlook in New York positive, but growing at a slower rate than we were seeing for the United States as a whole. Personal income only going up by 1.8%, GDP going up by only 1.7%, and employment going up at around like 42,000 per year. So this is generally positive, but it's a little on the slow side. And bear in mind, for these long-term forecasts, it's not a year for year exactly what's going to happen. It doesn't predict business cycles, but it does take, here's where the state is now, and here are the historical trends. So where are we going to go from here? And so in general, things are looking, positive, but not the fastest growing state in the union. Here are the fastest growing industries. And this is a pattern that has played itself out across the United States quite a bit, as we have an aging population and a shift towards a service economy away from manufacturing. Healthcare and social assistance growing at a huge clip over the course of 2020 to 2060. More technical services, more administration, transportation and warehousing is interesting, and then real estate rental and leasing. So with the exception of transportation, the fastest growing industries in our time frame are all service industries for New York. And then here's where things stand for the highest paying jobs in 2016, where they're going. So finance and insurance, obviously New York being one of the global centers of finance. Wholesale trade is an interesting one. Dealing in manufacturing goods, we can see that actually starts to decline slightly. Information closely related to tech, closely related to finance, closely related to everything that we find ourselves doing. Takes a little bit of a dip, but starts to grow back up by 2060. And then management and utilities remaining almost flat, almost level. Management seeing a little bit of a growth. So we're seeing a mixed bag as far as how the highest paid industries in New York are doing, a mix between increasing employment and decreasing employment. And then here's our long-term population pyramid. We can definitely see that aging population ballooning out from ages like 30 to 70. So one of the things that is going to matter for New York is how is it going to keep and retain a younger population to develop. And then here's where we are in 2060. Again, this is what demographers refer to as a constrictive one. And it's indicative of good things. It's indicative of generally of good social services, good healthcare, but it does also have the benefit of stagnating population growth. And here's where our population components are. So we see more international migrants coming on, but births are almost entirely equal, or are nearly equal with deaths. So that's the replacement rate is close to 1. But then we see an outflow of retired migrants and economic migrants as well, most likely for areas like Florida, or areas that are have faster growing economies, or with cheaper cost of living. And so, most of the population growth then is coming from international migrants. So now we're going to do a simulation. We're going to sort of not exaggerate, but we're going to test one of the things that has most recently come due to the coronavirus pandemic, which is working from home. We've seen mass migration, some coming from economic disruption, job losses, but also changing access to what it is to be a job. As we're demonstrating right now, being in person for large events is no longer the norm, and workplaces had, over the past year, increasingly found themselves relying on telework and telecommuting, and still able to accomplish much of what they want to. And so what that means is that gives people an extra freedom to move from high-priced areas to areas with lower cost of living. Because if all of your work can be done over the internet through a laptop screen, then it doesn't really matter where that laptop screen is, as long as the work is getting done. So REMI has a feature called a resident adjustment, and by default, our model assumes that money is earned where the job takes place. But as has already existed with interstate commuters and is increasingly existing with work from home, that no longer needs to be the case. Where the job is, quote unquote, is no longer the same thing as where you're working or where you're spending that money. And so this residence adjustment adjusts wages so that they function as incomes in other states. So a UChicago paper has an estimate based on ONET survey data of the percentage of jobs in a given industry that can be doable from home. This is based on stuff like how often does it require email, how much does it require access to a computer, how much requires working outside or heavy lifting. REMI, courtesy of our forecasts and BEA data, has a number of employees in each industry. And we also have the average annual wage rate in an industry in a given year. And so what we're doing is we're taking the percentage of the workforce that can work from home, estimated to have worked from home. We're taking the amount of money they're earning, and we're moving it, and we're taking 10% of that, just to be conservative, and moving it out of state. Here are the rankings of what these authors have estimated can be work from home, and it's about how you would think. So service jobs, so education, technical services, finance, those can largely be worked at home. Whereas more in-person jobs like forestry or accommodation and food services, those have to be on site. You can't serve people food remotely, at least not yet. And so to follow this, we're using private non-farm industries that fall under the sorted by 2-digit NAICS codes. So now I'm just going to open up the model, and we're going to actually see what this looks like. So yes, welcome to PI Plus. For this, we'll be using a 51 region model. So that's all 50 United States plus the District of Columbia. Edit, yeah, let's take a look at the inputs. And so we're taking the money out of the United States, or I'm sorry, we're taking money out of New York State. So around $500 million. Let's see. Yes. Oh, sorry, $5 billion, my mistake. And then we are putting that money into the rest of the United States. And we can actually see where that money is going. And this is spread a little bit by population, a little bit by jobs, depending on how different or how similar these states are from New York. So let's take a look at the forecast itself, and we'll see the results. So basic policy, $500 billion out of New York, $500 billion into the rest of the country. Actually, let's just make sure that we're setting it to the right region. Thank you. And there are many different policy variables that you can look at, different outcomes that you can assess when using PI Plus or our other adjacent softwares, but we're going to stick with the basics. We're going to stick with a high level just to see what sort of difference this money is making. So we've taken that money out. We've taken the income out of New York, and around $5 billion. And it's going to do a couple of things. Number one, fewer people are going to consume things in New York. There's still some spread as people from different states buy things from other states, but by and large, a lot of the supply for consumption happens locally. And then there's the knock-on effect that we'll see, because we're actually, look, that this total actually exceeds the amount that we took out of New York. So we took out $5 billion, but by 2030, we're seeing a loss of about $8.5 billion in consumption. And why that is because the output in certain industries falls. Sorry, navigating GoToWebinar's fun interface. So employment generally falls for industries. Whoops. There we go. And actually, if we rank them, we can see which are the hardest hit industries. So real estate, obviously, if people are moving out and people are spending less, that's going to take a big hit. State and local government is tied a lot to population. Retail generally has like a lower labor productivity, and so more shifts or bigger shifts in employment are required to make up differences in output. So we're seeing reduced consumption. We're seeing reduced, this is reduced output. So people are spending less within the state of New York. That reduces output for every industry. And then that decrease in output means that there's a decrease in employment, which has an additional effect on how much people are consuming because their incomes have been reduced. So it's this ripple effect, and it's a useful way to capture some of the complexities of the economy, some of the direct effects and the indirect effects of what is happening there. And then actually we can see a look to see which states are at the biggest advantage and which states are suffering the most under this, if I found the map correctly. Okay, yeah, we will just do impact profile. So actually what we want to do here is that we want to say, well, New York is hurt, but which states in general are seeing the biggest benefits and the smallest benefits? There we go. Output. We want to look at this as the whole map. So yeah, let's go to 2030. We only did this for 10 years, but we can see which states are doing all right. Silly map. There we go. So we can see the effect is actually kind of ambiguous. By hundreds of millions of dollars in either direction. So New Jersey is doing actually quite well for itself. That's where the bulk of the money ends up going. But we can see, Ohio down by tens of millions of dollars, Kansas up by $4 million. So there is a lot of interplay for where these states are purchasing different goods and where that money is flowing in. So that's what we wanted to show. We wanted to show off this illustration of what happens when we start to adjust for work from home. As a quick aside, I do want to show that Kurt, as May had said, things are looking a little more optimistic than that. And so what we're seeing now is like vaccinations rolling out faster than we could have thought a year ago. Yeah, let's view results. And so what we want to show here is just what it looks like if growth in GDP or components of GDP increases by 0.5 percentage points for every component. So consumption, government spending, investment, all of those. So let's just take a quick look here. That's it. There we go. Great. And differences. So now we'll be taking a look between like our baseline, which is the RSQE CBO forecasts, versus this more optimistic baseline with increased growth in GDP. So let's take a look at New York. And so, if we're seeing increased growth, increased vaccination, we're seeing increased consumer confidence, we're seeing increased spending on more in-person industries like tourism or various tourism adjacent industries. There we go. And things are looking pretty good. So we're seeing a little bit of a decrease in 2019. Actually, does that mean that I picked the right forecast? Excellent question. Let's just double check because I would hate to be telling you the wrong thing. That was it. Okay. So many baselines, so little time. Where Feb update? There we go. Okay. So yeah, if we're seeing like better growth in 2020 than we expected, you know, hundreds of thousands of jobs, like we're seeing, and especially in the short term where this is more variable, but more plausible, you know, we're seeing extra employment than we would have expected before. We're seeing more people back into the labor force by tens of thousands. I'm gonna do this as a percent change actually. Differences? Nah, forget it. And then coupled with that, we're seeing a change in the price index from where we were expecting. Again, not huge. I think one of the concerns that we're having with this recent stimulus spending is, are we going to actually, buck a 10-year trend and see some serious inflation? And there is something to that. But the changes that we're going to see in the price index, so, you know, going up by 0.5% higher, 0.5 percentage points higher than we were thinking, it's not going to be, at least in the short term, going to be the inflation apocalypse that might be a concern otherwise. So that's it for the model. I'm going to wrap up with some conclusions, and then we're going to open up the floor to you, our lovely audience, and Dee will moderate a question-answer session for us. So let's bring this presentation back. Skip to the end. You've all seen this before. So some points to consider, something that would flesh out the analysis more. We used a 51 region model that looked at every US state. REMI does have the capability to go down to the census tract level for much more localized regions. And so one of the things to consider is that we looked at New York State versus the rest of the country when a lot of the driving factor is actually New York City versus the rest of New York State when it comes to working from home and how much people are moving. So a more localized model, you can get some of those effects as people start working outside the city. Additional points to consider, so we move some at income, and REMI has intermediate demands by industry, which is like what goods, what inputs industries need for every dollar of output. But one of the big things that's happening right now is office space. If more people are working from home, are companies seriously going to downsize how much office space they need? How much are they going to rent? And then another thing to consider for New York State is the fiscal impacts. Like if more people are working outside of the state, more people are spending outside of the state, what is that going to do to budgets? And I believe that New York State is actually one of the states that already taxes commuter income just by how many people commute in from, as we said, Jersey, and the like. But if people are no longer spending things as much in New York State, what is that going to happen? Or what's going to happen to that? And to that end, REMI does offer another model called Tax PI that does a better or does a thorough job of looking at individual revenue items and tying them to specific policy variables. But for now, we were just looking at the economic impacts of the state as a whole. So some other takeaways from this: economic forecasts can be difficult. We just did a very simple one, but we saw that there could be some wild variation depending on different assumptions. Outbreak of COVID-19. No one saw that coming. Absolutely no one. At least in the economic sphere. And that effect cannot be understated how big an impact that was and how out of the blue that was. We've seen Joe Biden get elected as president with a radically different set of policies from his predecessor. And even when things are operating smoothly, even when the government is operating smoothly and operating consistently, there is still uncertainty about the economy as different factors come into play or more unexpected scenarios happen. And so that's where REMI can step in. So we have our forecasts that can be used to clarify, calculate, and communicate data. But then on top of that, you can do these scenarios, these simulations to test out different policies, to test out different recovery paths. Maybe you're looking at flood prevention. Maybe you're trying to lure more people to work back in your state. But the tool is sufficiently flexible and powerful that you can model anything with the right inputs. And it's dynamic. So rather than being a static each year treated separately, the model builds on itself. So additional capital stock in year 1 is going to mean more capital in year 2. And each year is treated in sequence with effects rippling out through time. So we thank you all for coming. Here are citations, including the Dingle and Nyman white paper that we used for work from home statistics.